My name is Beatrice Finch, and at 34 years old, I command an information empire that can make or break fortunes in the City of London. But my family still thinks I'm the quiet, peculiar girl who was always a bit of a gossip. They never imagined that the very skill they scorned, my uncanny ability to know everyone's business, would become the sweetest and most silent revenge, making me richer than all of them combined and ultimately their last and only hope. Before I dive into the story of how I turned my family's greatest insult into my greatest asset, I want to connect with all of you out there. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated or had a unique talent dismissed by the people who should have supported you the most, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe to join a community of people who understand that sometimes, the ones who are counted out are the ones who end up changing the entire game. My story didn't begin in a sleek glass tower overlooking the Thames, but in the suffocating quiet of a perfectly respectable suburban home. From the outside, the Finch family was the picture of middle-class success. My father, Marcus, ran a moderately successful import-export business built by his father before him. My mother, Philippa, curated our home and social calendar with the precision of a military strategist. And my brother Theodore, 2 years my senior, was the golden child, destined for greatness in the world of finance. He was charming, athletic, and effortlessly confident. Then there was me. I was the quiet one, the observer. I didn't have Theodore's easy charisma or my father's booming voice. I had something else, something they found unsettling, an insatiable curiosity and a memory that held on to details like a vault. At family gatherings, while other children ran screaming through the garden, I would find a comfortable armchair in the corner of the drawing room and just listen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, not really. It was more like the conversations were a complex symphony, and I was fascinated by the interplay of the different instruments. I learned to read the subtle shifts in tone, the flicker of an eyelid, the tightening of a hand around a wine glass. I could sense the unspoken tensions, the simmering resentments, and the fragile alliances. Information came to me naturally. I was a magnet for it. But in my family, this wasn't seen as a skill. It was a character flaw. I must have been about 10 years old at my grandfather's birthday party when I first felt the sting of their judgment. The house was full of relatives, the air thick with the smell of roast beef and my grandmother's perfume. I was sitting near my father and my Uncle Robert, who were discussing business. Uncle Robert was boasting about a new investment he was making in a company that manufactured some sort of revolutionary new textile. He spoke with such conviction, his voice full of booming optimism. But I had heard something earlier, a whispered conversation between my aunt and her friend in the hallway. They were talking about the same company, about how its charismatic founder was known for overpromising and underdelivering, and how 2 of his previous ventures had collapsed spectacularly. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the tone, worried, skeptical. Later, when my father asked me what I thought of Uncle Robert's grand plans, I replied honestly. "I think it sounds risky," I said, my small voice barely carrying over the clatter of cutlery. "I heard Aunt Mary say the man who owns the company is not very trustworthy." The table went silent. My father's face, which had been jovial, hardened into a mask of stern disapproval. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and cold, "we do not repeat idle chatter. It is impolite to listen in on other people's conversations, and it is certainly not your place to pass judgment on your uncle's business acumen. You're a gossip and no one likes a gossip." The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. My uncle laughed it off, but the damage was done. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. 6 months later, Uncle Robert's revolutionary textile company went bankrupt, and he lost a significant amount of money. My father never mentioned it, and I certainly never received an apology or an acknowledgement that my idle chatter had been correct. The lesson was clear. Being right didn't matter if it made people uncomfortable. What mattered was keeping quiet and not disrupting the carefully constructed narrative of our family's respectability. This pattern repeated itself throughout my childhood and teenage years. I noticed when my mother's best friend started wearing sunglasses indoors and using heavy concealer, and I quietly worried about what was happening at her home. My mother, catching me staring, chided me for being morbidly curious. When the friend later left her husband due to his violent temper, my mother was shocked, but my nosiness was never reframed as perception. It was simply forgotten. When Theodore was lauded for a history presentation that won him a school prize, I knew for a fact that he had lifted the core thesis from a book he'd seen a quieter, less popular classmate reading. I had seen him mock the boy for carrying it around just weeks before. When I tried to mention this to my parents, suggesting Theodore should at least give the boy some credit, I was accused of being petty and jealous of my brother's success. "You need to learn to be happy for him, Beatrice," my mother said, her tone laced with disappointment. "Tearing him down doesn't build you up." They saw jealousy where there was only a sense of fairness. They saw a flaw where I was simply seeing the truth that was right in front of them. So, I learned to internalize. I kept my observations to myself. My talent for gathering and connecting information didn't disappear. It just went underground. I became a librarian of secrets, cataloging the small inconsistencies, the unspoken truths, the intricate webs of relationships that defined the world around me. And I became exceptionally good at appearing to be exactly what they thought I was: quiet, unassuming, and completely unremarkable. After finishing a sensible but uninspired degree in business administration, I took a job that seemed perfectly suited to my persona: a junior administrative assistant at a prestigious law firm in Mayfair. The firm, Cromwell and Finch, no relation, a fact my father lamented often, was a shark tank of ambition, a place where billion-pound deals were made and broken. My job was to be invisible. I made coffee, I scheduled meetings, I bound documents, I was a ghost in the machine. And it was the perfect vantage point. No one pays attention to the admin. I was privy to everything. I saw the overconfident associates who were secretly drowning in debt. I heard the hushed, frantic phone calls about deals gone sour. I knew which partners were having affairs, which clients were on the verge of bankruptcy, and which secretaries held the real power in the office because they knew where all the bodies were buried. I didn't just hear the words, I collected the data points. The courier from a rival firm who always delivered to a specific partner at 4 p.m. on a Friday. The junior lawyer who suddenly started wearing a new expensive watch after a case settled for a suspiciously low amount. The tremor in a CEO's voice when he spoke about his company's quarterly projections. It was all information. And for the first time in my life I began to see it not as a source of shame, but as a source of power. My family of course saw none of this. To them my little job was a source of mild embarrassment. Dinners at the family home became a form of ritual humiliation. "Still making coffee for the big boys, are we, B?" Theodore would ask with a patronizing smirk, fresh from his trading floor where he was, by his own account, a master of the universe. My father would sigh and talk about Theodore's latest bonus or the new sports car he'd bought. "Theodore is building an empire, making real money," he'd say, giving me a pointed look. "It's about taking risks, Beatrice. Something you wouldn't understand from behind a filing cabinet." They painted my life as small and gray, a safe, boring little existence devoid of ambition. They had no idea that my world was more vibrant and complex than theirs could ever be, because I was the one who saw the intricate wiring behind the facade they all worshipped. The first real crack in my carefully constructed facade of mediocrity came not at work but at home. It was a small thing, really. The engine in my father's aging but cherished Jaguar had seized. The repair bill was several £1,000s, an unexpected expense that threw the delicate household budget into chaos. My father was storming around the house, cursing his luck. My mother was wringing her hands, talking about having to cancel their planned anniversary trip. I had been saving diligently for years. My lifestyle was modest and my salary, while not spectacular, was more than enough for my needs. I had a neat little nest egg tucked away. "Father," I said quietly during a lull in the storm, "I can help. I have some savings. I can cover the cost." He stopped his pacing and stared at me. For a moment I thought he saw me, really saw me. But then he let out a short, barking laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was dismissive, filled with ridicule. "You," he scoffed. "What could you possibly contribute, Beatrice? Your tip money." He turned to my mother. "Don't you worry, Philippa. I'll call Richard. He'll give me a loan. A Finch doesn't take handouts from his children, especially not pocket money." Theodore, who was lounging on the sofa, snickered into his phone. I felt my entire body go cold. It wasn't just the rejection of my offer. It was the utter contempt with which it was delivered. He would rather go into debt with a friend, a point of pride and masculine posturing, than accept help from his invisible daughter. I simply nodded, walked out of the room, and the quiet resolve that had been building in me for years finally hardened into something solid and unshakable. They would never see me. So I would stop trying to be seen. Instead, I would build something of my own, in the shadows where they had forced me to live. The opportunity to test my new resolve arrived sooner than I expected, wrapped in the quiet desperation of a colleague. Gideon was a junior associate at the firm, earnest and hardworking but perpetually out of his depth. He was on the verge of being fired. He was tasked with finding a crucial piece of information for a sensitive merger. Did the CEO of the target company have any hidden vices that could be used as leverage? It was the kind of distasteful but necessary due diligence that made or broke careers. Gideon had been hitting dead ends for weeks, and the partners were losing patience. I knew he was going to be let go at the end of the week. But I also knew the answer he was looking for. I knew it because I talked to the cleaning staff. Specifically, I talked to Maria, who cleaned the executive offices late at night. She told me how the CEO, Mr. Henderson, always had a specific brand of rare, expensive orchid delivered to his office every Monday, and how he always threw it out on Friday even if it was still beautiful. I knew from the mailroom assistant that Mr. Henderson received a personal hand-delivered package every Wednesday from a discreet courier service. And I knew from the security guard at the front desk, a lovely man named Patrick who loved to chat about his prize-winning roses, that Mr. Henderson was a passionate, almost obsessive amateur botanist. He didn't have a gambling problem or a secret lover. His vice was orchids. He was engaged in a fierce, secret rivalry with another collector, and he was spending a fortune, likely embezzling from a discretionary fund, to acquire the rarest specimens. It was a small, almost comical secret, but in the high-stakes world of corporate mergers, it was a loose thread that could unravel everything. That night, I typed up a short, anonymous note. Check the import logs for Phalaenopsis violacea blue chip. Cross-reference with the CEO's discretionary account. His weakness isn't women or cards. It's flowers. I printed it, slipped it into a plain envelope and left it on Gideon's desk after everyone had gone home. The next day the office was buzzing. Gideon had cracked the case. He was a hero. He was taken off probation and praised by the partners for his innovative investigative instincts. He never knew where the tip came from. But I did. And the feeling it gave me was intoxicating. It was a quiet, controlled display of power. I had saved a man's career with a piece of information that everyone else had overlooked. I had pulled the strings and no one had even seen my hands. Someone had, though. Or at least she had her suspicions. Ms. Diana Holloway was a senior partner at the firm, a woman who moved through the world with the lethal grace of a panther. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for being able to smell weakness from a mile away. She called me into her office the day after Gideon's triumph. Her office was immaculate, smelling of old leather and expensive perfume. I stood before her desk, my heart hammering in my chest, convinced I was about to be fired for overstepping my bounds. She watched me for a long, unnerving moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. "Gideon is a nice boy," she said finally, her voice like smooth, aged whiskey. "But he's not clever enough to have found the Henderson leverage on his own. Not in a million years." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You, on the other hand, Miss Finch. You are quiet. People forget you are in the room. I imagine you see and hear a great many things." I didn't say a word, my face a carefully blank mask. She smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Don't look so frightened. I'm not going to fire you. I'm going to offer you a proposition." She leaned forward, her eyes glittering with interest. "Information is the most valuable currency in this city, more valuable than gold or oil. And you, my dear, seem to have a natural talent for mining it. You see the patterns everyone else misses." She pushed a small, plain envelope across the desk towards me. "I have a personal matter. A rival is attempting to poach one of my most important clients. I need to know what they are offering him, who he has been meeting with, and where he is vulnerable. I need leverage. Find it for me. Discreetly. If you succeed, there is £5,000 in that envelope. A consulting fee." My world tilted on its axis. £5,000 was more than 2 months of my salary. But it was more than the money. It was validation. The one thing my family had always ridiculed in me, this sharp, powerful woman was offering to pay for. My gossip, my nosiness, my morbid curiosity. She was calling it a talent. I took the envelope. "I'll see what I can find, Miss Holloway," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. That night I didn't go home. I began to activate the informal network I hadn't even realized I'd been building for years. A quick call to a friend who worked as a waitress at a private members club in Pall Mall. A chat with the driver who serviced the rival firm's carpool. A conversation with the personal shopper at Harrods who helped the client's wife choose her outfits. Each person was a node in a web and each held a tiny piece of the puzzle. Within 48 hours I had the full picture. The client wasn't being poached, he was desperate. He had made a series of catastrophic personal investments based on bad advice from his son-in-law and was on the brink of personal bankruptcy. The rival firm wasn't offering him a better deal. They were offering him a bailout in exchange for his business and insider information. I typed up a concise 2-page report, detailing the bad investments, the exact amount of his debt, and the secret meetings he had been having. I didn't include how I got the information. I just presented the facts. I slipped it under Diana Holloway's office door before anyone arrived the next morning. An hour later, a notification appeared on my phone. £10,000 had been deposited into my bank account. The reference read simply, "Exceptional." 2 weeks later I walked into Cromwell and Finch for the last time. I submitted my resignation, citing a vague desire to pursue other opportunities. My boss was surprised but wished me well. My colleagues threw me a small, perfunctory leaving party with a cheap cake. No one had any idea that I was leaving my life as an invisible admin behind to become one of the most discreetly powerful people in the city. I used the money from Diana to set myself up. I didn't want a public office or a flashy website. My business would live in the shadows just as I had. I created a new identity, a nom de guerre that would become a whisper of legend in the highest circles of London, the Oracle. My method was simple and meticulously designed for anonymity. Clients would be referred to me by word of mouth only. Initial contact was made through a specially encrypted messaging application that routed through multiple servers around the world. My public face was a highly respected semi-retired solicitor named Mr. Davies, who would handle the initial vetting and all financial transactions. Payments were made through a complex series of shell corporations or, for the truly paranoid, in cryptocurrency. My brand was built on 2 pillars: absolute, unbreakable discretion and 100% accuracy. I didn't deal in rumors or speculation. I dealt in verifiable facts. Diana Holloway was my first official client, and she was worth her weight in gold. She referred me to a handful of her most trusted contacts: a hedge fund manager, a member of parliament, a shipping magnate. Each came to me with a problem that couldn't be solved through conventional channels. The hedge fund manager needed to know if the brilliant young CEO of a tech startup he was about to invest millions in had a hidden drug problem. I found out through a contact who cleaned the private airfield he used that he had a standing weekly order for delivery from a notorious dealer in Amsterdam. The deal was scuttled, saving my client a fortune. The politician was being blackmailed over a youthful indiscretion. She needed to know if the blackmailer had any other copies of the incriminating photos. My network tracked the blackmailer, a disgruntled former aide, and discovered he had foolishly stored the only other copy on an unsecured cloud server. My client's security team, armed with that knowledge, was able to neutralize the threat. Each success built my reputation. The whisper of the Oracle grew louder in the boardrooms and private clubs of the elite. They didn't know if I was a man or a woman, a single person or a collective. They only knew that the Oracle delivered results. My work was a delicate dance. It required patience, empathy, and an understanding of human nature. I built a network not of spies but of people. The overlooked, the undervalued, the invisible. Baristas, dog walkers, nannies, hotel concierges, personal assistants, security guards. These were the people who truly knew what was going on in the city. They saw the late-night departures, the secret meetings, the discarded documents, the tears behind closed doors. I didn't bribe them. I cultivated them. I listened to their problems, remembered their children's names, sent them thoughtful gifts. I paid them generously for information they often didn't even realize was valuable, framing it always as market research. In return, they gave me their trust. One of my most memorable early cases involved a wealthy heiress, the daughter of a prominent industrialist, who was engaged to a man who seemed almost too perfect. He was handsome, charming, independently wealthy from a supposed tech inheritance, and utterly devoted to her. Her father was suspicious and hired me to vet him. The task seemed impossible. The fiancé, let's call him Dominic, had a flawless public profile. But something felt off. I started pulling at the threads. His tech inheritance story was vague. I had a contact, a freelance archivist, dig into probate records. There was no record of a family member leaving him such a fortune. I had another contact, a woman who worked in the catering department of the exclusive health club he belonged to, mentioned his name to some of the older members. One of them vaguely remembered his family, not as tech billionaires, but as respectable but modest schoolteachers from Devon. The pieces started to click into place. He wasn't old money or new money. He was no money. The breakthrough came from a source I never would have expected. I was tracing his digital footprint and found a single unflattering review he'd left for a small, bespoke tailor in Naples years ago. It was an angry, entitled rant about a poorly fitted suit. On a hunch, I hired a local private investigator in Naples, a woman I'd used once before, to simply go and talk to the old tailor. The tailor, it turned out, had a long memory. He remembered Dominic vividly. Not as a wealthy client, but as the companion of a much older, very wealthy widow who had paid for his entire wardrobe. He even remembered the widow's name. A few more days of digging revealed Dominic's pattern. He was a professional chameleon, a fortune hunter who preyed on wealthy, lonely women, drained their accounts and then vanished. He had done it at least 3 times across Europe. I compiled my findings into a discrete file, complete with bank statements I'd procured from a contact at a Swiss bank and sworn affidavits from the tailor and the daughter of one of his previous victims. The heiress broke off the engagement. Her father paid me a bonus that could have bought a small house. While my secret life flourished, my public one remained unchanged. I still lived in my modest flat, drove my sensible car and wore clothes from the high street. When I went for the obligatory Sunday lunch at my parents' house, I was still just Beatrice, the boring administrator. My success was a secret I savored alone, a silent rebellion against their lifelong underestimation. And as my fortunes rose, theirs began to spectacularly decline. The world was changing, but my father refused to change with it. His import-export business, Finch & Sons, was an artifact of a bygone era. He relied on handshakes and decades-old relationships while nimble competitors were using sophisticated logistics software and global e-commerce platforms to run circles around him. He saw modernizing as a betrayal of his father's legacy. He called it soulless, impersonal. What it really was efficient, and it was making his business obsolete. He started losing clients, his profit margins shrinking to nothing. To compensate, he made a series of increasingly reckless decisions, pouring money into ventures that were doomed to fail, all to maintain the illusion of being a business titan. Theodore, the golden boy, was also flying too close to the sun. His career as a trader wasn't built on skill but on high-risk, high-leverage bets. For a while, in a booming market, he looked like a genius. He bought a flashy apartment in Canary Wharf, drove a ludicrously expensive car, and spoke in a constant stream of financial jargon designed to impress and intimidate. But he was just gambling, and the house always wins. When the market took a sudden downturn, he was wiped out. He wasn't just broke, he was in debt up to his eyeballs. He lost his job, his car was repossessed in the dead of night, and he was forced to quietly sell his apartment at a massive loss. The atmosphere at Sunday lunches became toxic. The forced cheerfulness was replaced with a thick, simmering resentment. My father's face was perpetually etched with worry, his temper short. My mother's smiles were brittle, her eyes constantly darting around as if looking for an escape. Theodore was a caged animal, bitter and defensive, lashing out at the smallest provocation. And somehow their collective misery always found its way to me. I was the safe target. My quiet, stable, unambitious life was an affront to their spectacular failures. "Must be nice to not have any real pressure, Beatrice," Theodore sneered one afternoon after a particularly tense argument with my father about money. "You just clock in, clock out. No risk. No reward." "At least we tried to build something," my father added, his voice heavy with self-pity. "We took on the world. It's more than can be said for some. They needed to believe my life was small to make their failures feel grand. They needed me to be the insignificant daughter so they could still feel like the patriarch and the heir apparent, even as their kingdom crumbled." Once, my mother broke down in the kitchen while we were washing up. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke of the mounting bills, the threatening letters from the bank. "I don't know what we're going to do, Beatrice," she whispered, her voice choked with despair. For a fleeting, foolish moment my resolve wavered. I opened my mouth to tell her. "I can fix this, Mum. I can write a check right now and make it all go away." But then I looked at her face, and I saw the years of gentle condescension, of favoring my brother, of siding with my father's dismissiveness. I knew what would happen. They would take the money, but they wouldn't respect where it came from. It would be a temporary reprieve, not a solution. They would see it as their due, a child's duty, not the earnings of a capable and successful woman. They had to learn the lesson themselves. So I closed my mouth, handed her a clean towel and said, "I'm so sorry, Mum. I'm sure you and Dad will figure something out." The words felt like stones in my throat, but they were necessary. My help had to come on my terms or not at all. The final, inevitable blow came on a gray Tuesday morning. A registered letter arrived. It was from the bank. They were initiating foreclosure proceedings on the family home. The house I grew up in, the one symbol of Finch family stability and success, was going to be taken from them. My father had leveraged it again and again to pump money into his dying business, and now the well was dry. They needed £2 million. And they needed it in 30 days. Panic set in. True naked panic. My father called every friend, every business associate, every distant relative in his address book. The answer was always the same. A polite but firm no. His reputation for poor financial judgment had spread. He was a bad risk. Theodore, stripped of his city contacts and his bravado, was useless. The family was trapped, spiraling towards ruin. It was during a desperate late-night phone call with an old acquaintance that my father heard the whisper. A name. A last resort. A mysterious, off-the-books investor known only as the Oracle. This person, the acquaintance said, was an enigma. They moved with absolute secrecy, had access to seemingly unlimited capital, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to assess risk. The terms were rumored to be strict, the process invasive, but the Oracle was known to be decisive and, if the investment was sound, incredibly effective. For my father, a man drowning in the wreckage of his own pride, this anonymous, mythical figure was the only lifeline he had left. He had no idea he was about to beg for help from the daughter whose opinion he had never once valued in his life. The process began with an arm's-length formality that must have been torture for my father. He couldn't just call the Oracle. He had to go through my solicitor, Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, a man of impeccable discretion and old-world gravitas, met my father in his mahogany-paneled office. He explained the terms of engagement. The Oracle would require a complete and unabridged look at every aspect of Finch & Sons and my father's personal finances. Every bank statement, every loan agreement, every tax return, every failed business plan. It was a complete financial colonoscopy, designed to strip away every last vestige of pride and delusion. I watched from the other side of my encrypted network as the documents came in. Each file was a chapter in a long story of hubris and denial. I saw the desperate loans, the foolish investments, the slow, agonizing bleed of capital over years. There were no surprises for me. I had heard the seeds of these failures discussed dismissively over countless Sunday dinners. I had watched it happen in real time, my silent observations a Cassandra-like prophecy they had refused to hear. Mr. Davies played his part perfectly. He communicated with my father with a cool, professional detachment, passing along the Oracle's requests for more information, for clarification on this or that disastrous decision. My father, humbled and broken, complied with every invasive demand. He was a man adrift, clinging to a piece of driftwood, and he would do anything he was told. He probably imagined the Oracle as some ruthless Russian oligarch or a shadowy hedge fund billionaire, a man much like the ones he had always aspired to be. The irony was a bitter, private pleasure. After 2 weeks of this grueling vetting process, Mr. Davies summoned my father for a final decision. "The Oracle has reviewed your proposal," he informed him over the phone, his voice giving nothing away. "The investment is problematic. However, my client sees a sliver of potential, not in the current business, but in the underlying assets and brand name. They are willing to consider a bailout, but they have one final, non-negotiable condition." "Anything," my father breathed into the phone, his voice raspy with desperation. "I'll do anything." My client insists on a face-to-face meeting. With you, your wife, and your son. Mr. Davies paused. This is highly unusual. In fact, it is unprecedented. But as I said, it is non-negotiable. A car will pick you up tomorrow at 10 a.m. Be ready. The request sent a ripple of confusion and terror through my family. Why would this powerful recluse want to meet them? But they had no choice. The next morning, a sleek, black, unmarked car collected them from the front of their house, the house that was about to be taken from them. My mother, Philippa, was dressed in her Sunday best, her face a pale mask of anxiety. Theodore, stripped of his usual arrogance, looked young and lost in an ill-fitting suit. My father, Marcus, sat ramrod straight, his jaw tight, trying to project a dignity he no longer possessed. The car took them not to a glittering skyscraper, but to a discreet, anonymous building in a quiet part of the city. They were led by a silent assistant down a stark, white corridor into a minimalist boardroom. The room was dominated by a long dark wood table and 12 empty chairs. There was a pitcher of water and 3 glasses. The air was cold and sterile. They sat waiting for what felt like an eternity. The silence was thick with their fear and unspoken resentments. They were a family shipwrecked, waiting to learn their fate at the hands of a stranger. Finally, the door at the far end of the room opened with a soft click. They all looked up, their expressions a mixture of hope and dread. And then I walked in. I wasn't the Beatrice they knew. I wasn't their mousy, invisible daughter in a sensible cardigan. I was wearing a bespoke dark gray power suit that had cost more than my father's car. My hair was styled in a severe, elegant chignon. My face was calm, my posture erect. I moved with a quiet confidence that was utterly alien to them. I walked to the head of the table, my heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor, and sat down. For a full 10 seconds they just stared, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. My father was the first to speak, his voice a confused croak. Beatrice, what is this? Is this some kind of a joke? Are you the new secretary? Theodore let out a nervous, incredulous snort. B, what are you doing here? Did you follow us? You need to leave, they'll be here any minute. My mother was simply frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with shock. I ignored their sputtering. I looked towards the door and Mr. Davies entered, carrying a single slim leather portfolio. He placed it on the table in front of me with a respectful nod. Miss Finch, he said, his voice clear and formal. The proposal from Finch and Sons. The use of my formal title, the deference in his tone, was the final piece that shattered their reality. The confusion on my father's face curdled into a dawning, horrified comprehension. You, he whispered, the word choked with disbelief. You are the Oracle? I met his gaze directly, my expression unreadable. I've reviewed the financials, I began, my voice even and cool as if I were discussing a stranger's portfolio. The business model is obsolete. The debt-to-asset ratio is catastrophic. The management, I paused, letting my eyes drift from my father to my brother, has demonstrated a consistent and catastrophic pattern of poor judgment and an inability to adapt to a changing market. I began to list their failures one by one with cold, dispassionate precision. The failed expansion into Eastern Europe that I had overheard my father being warned against by his own accountant. The currency speculation that Theodore had bragged about at Christmas, a bet that had cost the company £250,000. The refusal to invest in a modern logistics system, a decision that had led to the loss of their 3 largest clients. Each point was a fact, a piece of gossip I had collected over years of being ignored. How could you know all this? My father stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. You've been spying on me. This is monstrous. You are a gossip, Beatrice. A nosy little girl who delights in the misfortune of others. You called it gossip, father, I replied, my voice dangerously soft. I call it data. You condemned my curiosity. My clients, on the other hand, pay millions for it. The very talent you taught me to be ashamed of is the foundation of my entire enterprise. I let that sink in. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by my mother's quiet, ragged breathing. Theodore looked as if he had been punched. My father was shaking, a mixture of rage and utter humiliation warring on his face. I will grant the loan, I said, and a collective desperate sigh of relief went through them. They thought they had won. They thought this was over. However, I continued, It will not be a loan. It will be an acquisition. And it comes with several conditions. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the cool surface of the table. Condition 1. You, father, will announce your immediate retirement. You will have no further operational or financial say in the company that bears your name. Your legacy is one of failure and it ends today. His face went white. Condition 2, Theodore. You will have no position, no title, and no involvement whatsoever in the new company. You have proven yourself to be incompetent and reckless. Your personal debts are your own to solve. My brother flinched as if I had struck him. Condition 3. I will be appointing a new CEO, a professional of my choosing, to restructure and modernize the entire operation. Her decisions will be final. I paused, saving the most painful blow for last. And finally, condition 4. The family home will be signed over to a trust. A trust that I control. You will be permitted to live there for now as tenants. But you will never again own it. It will never be leveraged to fund your egos. The house is no longer an asset for you to squander. My father slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted in a mask of fury. Never. This is my house. My company. You would humiliate me like this? Your own father. He was sputtering, his pride fighting its last desperate battle. I looked at him not with anger or triumph but with a profound, weary sadness. The little girl in me who had so desperately wanted his approval was finally, truly gone. In her place was a woman who understood the cold, hard currency of consequences. Humiliation? I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. No, father. This is not humiliation. This is a bailout on my terms. This is the consequence of underestimating me for 34 years. This is the price of the loan. You can accept my terms or you can leave this room and watch everything you built turn to dust. The choice, I said, pushing the signature-ready documents across the table towards him, is yours. The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever known. My father stared at the documents, his chest heaving. The pen lay there, a small black instrument that held the power to either save his world or shatter it completely. He looked at my mother, whose face was a mess of tears and confusion. He looked at Theodore, who refused to meet his gaze, staring instead at his own hands as if he'd never seen them before. The fight went out of him like air from a balloon. With a shaking, palsied hand, Marcus Finch, the man who had called me a gossip and laughed at my offer of help, picked up the pen and signed away his legacy, his home, and his pride to the daughter he had never truly seen. The ride home for them must have been a funereal procession. I didn't go with them. My work was done. I remained in the boardroom with Mr. Davies, signing the corresponding paperwork that officially made me the owner of everything my family had once held dear. The changes were immediate and decisive. The following Monday, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a brilliant turnaround specialist I'd had my eye on for years, walked into the offices of Finch & Sons as its new CEO. She was sharp, ruthless in her efficiency, and had no patience for the old-fashioned sentimental nonsense that had been strangling the company. She gutted the inefficient departments, invested heavily in technology and renegotiated every single supplier contract. Within 3 months the bleeding had stopped. Within 6 the company was breaking even. My father, now officially retired, was a ghost haunting the halls of the house he no longer owned. He would wander from room to room, his shoulders stooped, the booming confidence that had defined him utterly extinguished. For weeks he refused to speak to me, looking right through me as if I wasn't there. It was a punishment, I knew, but it had no effect on me. I had lived in his shadow my whole life. His silence was a familiar landscape. My mother, on the other hand, tried to adapt with a desperate, cloying attentiveness. She started making my favorite childhood meals, asking about my day with a bright, fearful interest, complimenting my clothes. Her respect was so clearly transactional, born of fear and a new, bewildering dependence on me. I found it more insulting than my father's silence. It was a constant reminder that their affection was conditional, tied not to who I was, but to what I could provide. Theodore was the most outwardly hostile. He saw my intervention not as a rescue, but as a hostile takeover motivated by spite. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" he confronted me one evening, his voice dripping with venom. "Watching Dad sign those papers. Tearing him down. It's what you've always wanted." I looked at him, my now aimless, jobless brother, drowning in his own mistakes. I saved this family from homelessness, Theodore, I said calmly without raising my voice. You're confusing a consequence with a motive. You should be more concerned with finding a way to pay back your creditors than with analyzing my intentions. I was setting a boundary, a hard line he could not cross. The dynamic had been irrevocably inverted. I held all the cards and they were slowly, painfully realizing that the old rules no longer applied. A year passed. It was a year of awkward silences, of tentative adjustments, of a new reality slowly cementing itself. Finch & Sons, under Sarah Jenkins's leadership, was thriving. It had become a lean, modern, and profitable enterprise. The name was the same, but the soul of the company was entirely new. Theodore, humbled by months of unemployment and a mountain of debt, had finally taken a modest sales job at a logistics company. It was unglamorous work, but for the first time in his life he was earning an honest living based on his own merit. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a grudging, weary respect for me. We would never be close, but we had reached a state of functional, peaceful coexistence. My mother, freed from the constant pressure of maintaining a social standing they could no longer afford, had started volunteering at a local hospice. She found a sense of purpose there that had been missing for years. Our conversations became less about appearances and more about real things. We were building something new, something fragile but more honest than what we'd had before. The breakthrough with my father came on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was in the garden and he came out to join me, the first time he had willingly sought out my company in over a year. He looked older, smaller, but the anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out sadness. We stood in silence for a while, looking at the rose bushes his father had planted decades ago. The company made a profit last quarter, he said finally, his voice raspy. A real one. Sarah Jenkins sent me the report. I nodded. She's very good at what she does. He turned to look at me and for the first time I felt like he was actually seeing me, Beatrice. Not the gossip, not the quiet disappointment, but the woman standing in front of him. I never saw you, Bea, he said, his voice cracking. All those years I was so busy looking at your brother, at the image of success I wanted for him, for myself, that I never saw the brilliant, capable woman who was right here all along. Your mother and we failed you. I am so sorry. The apology was quiet, unadorned, and utterly sincere. It was the one thing I had longed to hear for most of my life. And as I stood there listening to the words, I realized something profound. It didn't matter as much as I thought it would. The gaping hole that his disapproval had left in me had already been filled. I had filled it myself with my own achievements, my own self-worth, my own quiet empire built from the scraps of their disregard. I accept your apology, Dad, I said, and I meant it. We could start to heal, but we could never go back. I no longer needed his validation to feel whole. My life now is divided in two. In one, I am Beatrice Finch, the daughter who visits her parents on Sundays, who has a quiet but respectful relationship with her brother. In the other, I am the Oracle, a name whispered in the most powerful rooms in London. My work continues. My network is stronger than ever. I still trade in the currency of information, but my perspective has changed. It's no longer about the quiet thrill of power or the secret satisfaction of revenge. It's about clarity. It's about revealing the truth that lies just beneath the surface. I look out from my office window over the sprawling, magnificent city, a place of infinite secrets. A notification pings on my encrypted device. A new client. A new puzzle to solve. And I smile. The game is still afoot. What I learned through all of this is that the things people criticize in you are often the source of your greatest power. My family saw a gossip. A visionary client saw a data analyst. My family saw nosiness. The world's elite saw strategic intelligence. They tried to shame me into being smaller, but they inadvertently gave me the tools to build an empire. Your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It is something you define and build for yourself. Sometimes, the greatest gift those who underestimate you can give you is the motivation to prove them wrong, not for their benefit but for your own peace of mind. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a skill or a personality trait that others dismissed, only to find it become a strength in your life? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about turning life's challenges into triumphs. Remember that family is not just about blood. It's about the people who see you, support you, and value you for exactly who you are. Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the strength to build your own empires, whatever they may be.